Imagine you are sitting in this packed, incredibly sweltering courtroom in the 1850s.
Oh, I can practically feel the heat.
Right. The room is just overflowing. People are fanning themselves. They're leaning over the wooden railings, just hanging on every single word.
And this is a federal trial, so the stakes are massive.
Exactly. At the front of the room, you have a federal prosecutor, and he is just sweating through his wool suit.
Which is a terrible fabric choice for the 1850s, by the way.
Seriously. But he is laying out what appears to be, like, the most airtight, irrefutable legal case in the history of the American judicial system.
He's got everything.
He has mountains of physical evidence. He has signed documents. He has the literal weapons confiscated from the defendants sitting right there.
It's basically a slam dunk.
A total slam dunk. He points to a federal law that has been on the books for decades, a law whose language is completely clear, universally known, and absolutely unambiguous.
And the defendants don't even deny what they did, right?
No, they don't deny a thing. The evidence is overwhelming. And yet, the prosecutor knows, the judge knows, the defendants know, and every single person sweating in that gallery knows. The 12 men sitting in the jury box are never, ever going to convict.
Not in a million years.
Because half the country has simply decided that this specific federal law just no longer applies to them.
It's a total breakdown of the system.
It really is. So, welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to unpack this massive historical dossier on 1850s America, a period where the United States government found itself completely paralyzed.
Yeah, they were essentially turning against their own citizens.
Right, a very specific breed of citizens known as filibusters.
And we should probably define that term right out of the gate.
Yeah, definitely, because I think most people have a very different definition in their head.
For sure. Because for anyone listening today, a filibuster brings to mind a politician in a rumpled suit standing on the Senate floor.
Right, like reading the phone book for 24 hours straight to block a bill.
Exactly. That is a procedural delay tactic. But in the context of the 1850s, the word meant something entirely different.
And frankly, far more dangerous.
Oh, incredibly dangerous. A filibuster back then was a private American citizen who decided to, well, just raise his own private army.
Which is insane to even think about today.
It is wild. They would purchase military-grade weapons, charter a fleet of ships, and just sail off to violently conquer a foreign nation.
A nation that the United States was officially at peace with.
Exactly. Entirely off the books. Completely illegal.
Okay, let's unpack this because the sheer audacity of that concept is staggering.
It really is.
Like, we aren't talking about official military campaigns declared by Congress.
No, not at all.
We're talking about guys who basically woke up on a Tuesday, looked at a map of the Caribbean or Central America, and just decided they wanted to be the supreme ruler of another country.
It's pure hubris.
So today, we are going to look at the legal framework that was actually supposed to stop them, specifically the Neutrality Act.
Which clearly didn't work out as intended.
Right. We'll explore the complete breakdown of that law in local courtrooms, and we're going to dive into the Ostend Manifesto.
Oh, the Ostend Manifesto. That is a massive diplomatic crisis.
It really exposed the dark underlying motives of these invasions.
It did.
And then we will follow this entire movement to its bitter, unsentimental end, which is the execution of the most notorious filibuster of them all, William Walker.
A fascinating and tragic figure.
So the central mystery we have to untangle for you today is this. When the federal government finally started trying to crack down on these private wars, were they genuinely trying to uphold the rule of law?
Or were they just desperately playing sectional politics as the country hurtled toward the Civil War?
Exactly.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we are looking at a story that goes far beyond rogue military expeditions in the tropics.
It's much bigger than that.
Yeah, this entire era and the phenomenon of filibustering itself really serves as a miniature preview of the constitutional breakdown that would tear the United States apart in 1861.
What a dress rehearsal for the Civil War.
Precisely. It is the story of a nation slowly realizing that its citizens no longer shared a common reality, a common morality, or, frankly, a common understanding of what the law even meant.
So to understand how the law broke down, I think we need to understand what the law actually was.
That's a good place to start.
Because my assumption, reading through the sources, is that launching a private war has literally never been legal in the United States.
You would be completely correct. The legal reality strictly on paper, was incredibly robust. We have to go all the way back to the Neutrality Act of 1794.
Okay, so Washington's era.
Right, which was later reinforced and strengthened in 1818. This was a sweeping federal statute.
And what did it actually say?
It explicitly made it a high misdemeanor, which was a very serious federal crime, for anyone within the jurisdiction of the United States to begin, set on foot, provide, or prepare the means for any military expedition.
And that applies to any foreign prince or state with whom the U.S. was at peace?
Right.
The language there, like set on foot, provide or prepare the means, that covers basically everything.
It leaves zero wiggle room.
You couldn't recruit soldiers, you couldn't buy cannons, you couldn't lease a steamship if the end goal was invading a sovereign neighbor.
None of it. It was all highly illegal.
But I'm curious about the historical context of that original 1794 law. Like, why did the Founding Fathers feel the need to make this so explicitly illegal right out of the gate?
Well, it was a very specific fear.
Was something driving George Washington's administration to do this?
Oh, absolutely. The driving fear was existential survival.
Really? Survival?
Yeah, think about it. In 1794, the United States was a brand new, incredibly fragile, economically vulnerable nation.
True. They barely had a standing army.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the French Revolution was completely destabilizing Europe, and a massive war was breaking out between France and Great Britain.
So the whole world is basically on fire.
Right. And Washington and his cabinet looked at their fledgling country and realized that their greatest threat wasn't just a foreign invasion.
What?
Their greatest threat was their own citizens.
Wow. Really?
Yes.
Yeah.
They were terrified that enthusiastic private Americans might decide to, go fight for the French or try to violently seize Spanish Florida.
Oh, I see.
And in doing so, they could accidentally drag the entire United States into a global superpower conflict.
Which would have completely destroyed them.
The country would have been crushed before it even learned to walk.
So the Neutrality Act was basically a survival mechanism.
Exactly. It was the federal government drawing a hard line and saying the state, and only the state, possesses the monopoly on declaring war and conducting foreign policy.
Which makes perfect sense when you are a vulnerable startup nation.
It's the only logical choice.
You simply cannot have a few thousand guys in a tavern in Philadelphia deciding they are going to declare war on the Spanish Empire.
No, you definitely cannot.
The federal government has to be the adult in the room.
Right.
But as we move into the 1850s, the dynamic shifts completely.
Radically.
The United States is larger, wealthier, and, frankly, far more aggressive.
Much more aggressive.
And the text of the Neutrality Act hasn't changed a single comma, but the reality of trying to enforce it had become this theatrical farce.
Oh, a total circus.
Because the recurring problem, the absolute brick wall that the federal government kept hitting, was the local jury box.
The jury box became the graveyard of federal authority.
That's a great way to put it.
We see this play out vividly in New Orleans between 1850 and 1851.
Okay, tell me about that. Who was involved?
There was a former Spanish military officer named Narciso Lopez.
Okay, I remember him from the dossier.
Right. He had fled to the United States and began organizing these massive, heavily armed expeditions of American citizens.
To do what exactly?
To invade Cuba and overthrow the Spanish colonial government.
Wait, I want to pause on the mechanics of that because how does a guy just organize a massive military expedition in plain sight?
It's a great question.
Like, if the Neutrality Act says you can't prepare the means, how is Lopez getting guns and ships without the federal government immediately shutting him down?
Well, he was operating this bizarre gray area of public sympathy and legal loopholes.
Ah, okay.
And it was funded by an incredibly sophisticated financial scheme.
Really? How did he fund it?
Lopez didn't just ask for donations. He issued bonds.
Wait, like official financial securities?
He literally sold financial securities backed by the public lands of the future Republic of Cuba.
That is wild. He's selling land he doesn't even own yet.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
He promised investors that if they funded his invasion, and he won, they would receive prime Cuban real estate and massive returns on their
Now,
investment.
people actually bought these.
Oh, wealthy Southern planters, ambitious merchants, and local politicians were buying these bonds in droves.
So they're completely financially invested in his illegal war.
Completely. So when he started buying surplus military muskets and chartering steamships, he wasn't doing it in secret at midnight.
He was just doing it out in the open.
He was doing it in bustling southern ports, where the local customs officials, the local mayors, and the local merchants were often financially or ideologically invested in his success.
So they just looked the other way.
Or actively helped him.
So by the time the federal government actually intercepts him and brings him to trial in New Orleans, the environment is already hopelessly compromised.
It was over before it started.
The prosecutors are trying to enforce this strict legal code from 1818, laying out the exact text of the law, presenting the confiscated weapons, the ship manifests, the bond documents.
The evidence was undeniable.
And the juries just sit there and say, well, no.
They completely declined to convict.
It's just baffling.
You really have to put yourself in the mindset of those 12 men sitting in the New Orleans courtroom.
How are they rationalizing this?
Well, to the federal prosecutor sent from Washington, Narciso Lopez and his men are committing clear-cut, dangerous felonies that threaten national security and diplomatic relations with Spain.
Right, the Washington perspective.
But to the New Orleans jury, they're operating on an entirely different moral and political frequency.
Meaning what?
They aren't looking at criminals. They are looking at local boys, native sons, who are attempting to expand American greatness.
I want to look at another trial that really highlights the absurdity of this.
Which one?
Let's look at William Walker's trial in San Francisco in 1856.
Oh, yes. A classic example.
Because at this point, Walker is basically the undisputed rock star of the filibustering world.
He was famous.
He has just attempted a disastrous invasion of the Mexican state of Sonora.
It went terribly.
The federal authorities finally managed to arrest him. They drag him into a federal courtroom. And the judge in this case is not messing around.
No, he was very strict.
He gives the jury incredibly pointed instructions. He basically spells out the evidence and tells them it is their sworn legal duty to convict this man.
And we must note the precedent here.
Oh, right. What happened before?
Earlier, in that exact same jurisdiction, lesser-known men who had participated in similar expeditions had actually been convicted under the exact same law.
So it wasn't impossible to get a conviction.
No, the legal framework functioned when applied to the foot soldiers or the nobodies. The mechanism for conviction was definitely there.
But not for Walker.
No, not for Walker.
The jury goes into deliberation, and they come back with an acquittal in roughly 8 minutes.
8 minutes.
8 minutes. That isn't a deliberation. That's just waiting long enough to make it look like you sat down.
It's insulting to the process, really.
And Walker just walks out of the courtroom a free man to the cheers of thousands of supporters in the streets of San Francisco.
He was a hero to them.
It reminds me of a hometown crowd at a sports game, completely disregarding the referee's rulebook because they desperately want their home team to win.
That's a really good way to look at it.
The referee is standing there, blowing the whistle, pointing directly at the rulebook, and the entire stadium is just drowning him out, rendering him completely powerless.
Yeah, the rulebook basically ceases to exist if the crowd collectively refuses to acknowledge the authority of the official.
So true.
That analogy captures the dynamic perfectly. The referee's authority is entirely dependent on the collective consent of the arena.
And they had lost that consent.
Exactly. When we analyze why the hometown crowd, these southern and western juries, was cheering so intensely for the filibusters, we have to look at the powerful ideologies driving the era.
Right. Why did they view these illegal invasions as heroic acts?
For many, it was the intoxicating pull of manifest destiny.
Okay, the idea that they were meant to take over the continent.
Yes. The deeply held belief that Providence itself had ordained the United States to spread its institutions, its culture, and its borders across the entire continent.
And logically down into the Caribbean and Central America, right?
Exactly.
But I'm reading the source material, and it seems like manifest destiny is just sort of the polite, philosophical cover story.
Well, it was a very convenient cover story.
Mm-hmm. When you look at the South specifically, this wasn't just about abstract geography or spreading democracy.
No, not at all.
It was deeply, inextricably tied to the survival and expansion of slavery.
That is the core mechanism driving the Southern sympathy.
I thought so.
When a New Orleans juror looked at Narciso Lopez, or when a Southern politician defended William Walker, they saw men who were doing the brutal, necessary work of enlarging the empire of slavery.
Because they needed more slave states.
Exactly. The Southern states were locked in a desperate political math equation with the North.
Right, the balance in the Senate.
They needed new territories to eventually become new slave states in order to maintain their political balance of power in the U.S. Senate.
So Cuba, Nicaragua, northern Mexico, these weren't just random conquests for glory.
No, they were potential future slave states.
Okay, that makes it so much clearer.
So Southern jurors clearly valued their regional loyalty, their economic model, and their geographic ambition far above any national neutrality statute.
They were engaging in textbook jury nullification. And just to clarify for you listening, jury nullification is when a jury acknowledges that the defendant broke the law, but they simply refuse to convict because they believe the law is unjust, or in this case, because they just don't care what the federal government thinks.
Exactly. And this brings us to how modern historians interpret this specific conflict over the filibusters.
What's the modern take on it?
They don't just view it as a series of quirky legal failures. They view it as a failed constitutional crisis.
A constitutional crisis. That's a strong label.
It is, but think about it. When you step back and observe a federal law that is utterly incapable of securing a conviction in half the geographical area of the country, that law is no longer a foundational legal principle.
Right. It's just a suggestion.
It is merely a bargaining position. The recurring acquittals prove that the national legal consensus of the United States had already fractured.
The social contract was basically voided in certain zip codes.
That's exactly what happened.
A law that only applies in Boston but is completely ignored in New Orleans isn't really a federal law anymore.
Not in any practical sense.
So if the domestic courtrooms were a lost cause, how was the federal government trying to handle this massive desire for expansion on the international stage?
Well, the transition from the sweaty local courtrooms to the gilded halls of European diplomacy reveals something pretty shocking.
What's that?
That the line between the rogue filibuster and the official U.S. diplomat was surprisingly porous.
Okay, I'm looking at this meeting in October 1854. The administration of President Franklin Pierce sends 3 of its highest-ranking diplomats to Europe to try and solve the Cuba problem.
Right.
You have James Buchanan, the U.S. minister to Great Britain, who, of course, later becomes president.
Yes.
You have John Y. Mason, the minister to France. And you have Pierre Soule, the minister to Spain. Now, from what I gather in the dossier, Soule is the real wild card here.
Oh, Pierre Soule is one of the most fascinating and volatile figures of the era.
Tell me about him.
He was a French exile, a fierce romantic radical, a known duelist, and a Louisiana politician who was absolutely rabid about American expansion.
A duelist? That says a lot about his personality.
It really does. He saw no boundary whatsoever between his own personal sense of honor and the national destiny of the United States.
So they send this guy to Spain.
Yes. He was sent to Spain with the explicit goal of acquiring Cuba, and he pursued it with the subtlety of a sledgehammer.
So these 3 men meet, first in Ostend, Belgium, and then they retreat to Aachen in Germany.
Right.
And they sit down to draft a highly confidential diplomatic dispatch to their superiors in Washington.
Which is meant to be top secret.
Right. And Spain currently owns Cuba. Spain has made it abundantly clear they have absolutely no intention of selling Cuba.
None. They refused.
So what is the official recommendation of these top-tier American diplomats?
Well, the document they draft becomes known to history as the Ostend Manifesto.
And when you read the actual text, the underlying logic is just chilling.
It really is.
These 3 men declare, in official diplomatic writing, that Cuba was, quote, as necessary to the North American Republic as any of its present members.
They are elevating a Spanish colony to the same level of existential importance as New York, Virginia, or Massachusetts.
Which is an incredible leap of logic.
It is.
They're essentially saying, we need this island so badly that it practically belongs to us already.
The justification only gets more aggressive from there.
Right.
The crucial segment of the manifesto outlines their proposed solution.
What do they propose?
They argue that the United States should offer Spain a massive sum of money for the island, up to $120 million, an astronomical figure at the time.
That's a huge amount of money.
It is. But they conclude if Spain, acting on its sovereign right, refuses to sell, then the United States would be justified in wresting Cuba away from Spain by force.
Wresting it away.
Yes.
I love how diplomatic language tries to dress up violence.
It's very thinly veiled.
They are basically advising the president, we will make them an offer, and if they say no, we're going to rob them at gunpoint.
And we will be completely morally justified in doing so.
It's just wild.
They took the exact core impulse of the illegal filibuster, the desire to invade a foreign territory and take it by force, and elevated it to official state policy.
The only difference between William Walker and Pierre Soule was the tailored suit and the government letterhead.
Exactly.
But I'm struggling to understand the actual rationale they used in this document.
How so?
Surely they couldn't just write a memo saying, we want more sugar plantations, so let's start a war.
Right, they had to dress it up.
How did they justify unprovoked military aggression against a European power in an official document?
Well, they didn't rely on greed to make their case. They weaponized global tensions and deep-seated racial paranoia.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
The Ostend Manifesto is laced with the threat of what they called Africanization.
Africanization. That was a specific buzzword that carried a lot of weight in the 1850s, right?
It was terrifying to them.
Break down the mechanics of that fear for us. Where does that paranoia come from?
The root of that fear lies just a few decades earlier in the Haitian Revolution.
Okay.
Enslaved people in the French colony of Saint-Domingue had successfully overthrown their colonizers, defeated European armies, and established a free Black republic.
Which was a massive historical achievement.
But for the slave-holding American South, Haiti was the ultimate psychological nightmare.
Because it proved a rebellion could win.
It was living proof that violent, successful slave uprisings were possible.
I see.
So the diplomats at Ostend argued that Spain was a decaying power, too weak to maintain order in Cuba.
Okay.
And they fueled a conspiracy theory that British abolitionists were secretly plotting to incite a massive slave rebellion on the island.
So they were basically saying, if we don't take it, the British are going to trigger a rebellion.
Exactly. If that happened, they argued, Cuba would be Africanized, it would become a second Haiti.
And having a free, armed Black republic sitting just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, right on the doorstep of the southern plantation economy, was viewed as an existential threat to their entire way of life.
Precisely. The logic they constructed was incredibly cynical.
Yeah, it's very manipulative.
They argued that the United States had to preemptively invade and conquer Cuba to save the island from itself.
Which was really just code for protecting the institution of slavery in the American South.
Yes. They explicitly tied American national security to the preservation of slavery.
It's like a corporate merger memo where the executives accidentally CC the rival company, revealing that they aren't actually interested in a fair buyout.
Right. They're planning a hostile takeover based on entirely fabricated threats.
Because, of course, this highly confidential dispatch doesn't stay confidential.
Secrets in Washington rarely do.
Especially not with someone like Soule involved.
Right. Especially when you have someone as loud and self-promoting as Pierre Soule in the process.
But what happens when it gets out?
By early 1855, the contents of the Ostend Manifesto leak to the press, and it drops into the American political landscape like an absolute bomb.
We really have to picture the environment this document is dropping into. The timeline is so crucial here.
It is.
It's early 1855. The Kansas-Nebraska Act has recently passed, which basically tore up the Missouri Compromise.
And opened the Western territories to the potential expansion of slavery.
Right. You have bleeding Kansas happening, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers are literally engaging in guerrilla warfare against each other.
It was incredibly violent.
The Republican Party is forming in the North with the explicit goal of stopping the expansion of slavery. The national anxiety is at a boiling point.
Everything is incredibly tense.
And right into that environment, the Northern public reads a leaked document proving that their own diplomats are plotting to violently conquer Cuba to create a new slave state.
The reaction in the Northern press is explosive and immediate.
I can imagine.
Horace Greeley, the editor of the highly influential New York Tribune, plasters the story on his front pages.
What does he say?
He brands the Ostend Manifesto, the Manifesto of the Brigands.
The brigands! That's a strong word.
He is telling his readership that the top diplomats representing the United States and Europe are operating with the moral compass of highway robbers and alleyway thugs.
The backlash is so severe that the Pierce administration has to go into full damage control mode.
They were scrambling.
The very president who authorized these men to solve the Cuba problem suddenly has to frantically disavow their methods.
They issue statements essentially claiming the diplomats went rogue.
Which is just throwing them under the bus.
Even John Y. Mason, one of the co-authors, starts quietly backtracking and regretting his signature.
But the political damage is irreversible, right?
Oh, absolutely. What's fascinating here is how the Ostend Manifesto permanently shifted Northern perception of the entire filibustering movement.
It was a point of no return for public opinion.
Completely.
Because before this leak, how did an average Northerner view a guy like William Walker?
Before Ostend, A Northerner reading the newspaper might view a filibuster as a chaotic freelancer.
Okay, like a rogue actor.
Maybe a dangerous criminal. Maybe a misguided romantic adventurer with a god complex. But ultimately, a lone wolf operating outside the bounds of official society.
But after Ostend, that narrative collapses.
Completely. After the manifesto leaked, the filibuster was no longer seen as a rogue actor.
How are they seen?
In the Northern mind, the private filibuster was suddenly inextricably welded to the official covert policy of what the new Republican Party was calling the slave power.
The slave power conspiracy.
Yes.
This was the widespread Northern belief that a cabal of wealthy Southern elites secretly controlled all the levers of the federal government, the presidency, the Supreme Court, foreign policy.
And were using national resources solely to protect and expand slavery.
And the Ostend Manifesto was viewed as the smoking gun proving the conspiracy was real.
It was all the proof they needed.
The Northern public didn't suddenly develop a deep philosophical aversion to private war-making or a sudden reverence for international law.
No, it wasn't about the law itself.
They turned violently against filibustering because the Ostend Manifesto proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that private war-making was a direct proxy for expanding slave territory.
That was the turning point.
Wait, hold on, though. I'm struggling to buy that this was entirely 100% about slavery.
Why is that?
Were there really no people in the North who were just genuinely horrified that Americans were acting like pirates?
Yeah.
Like, was literally everyone in the 1850s just playing 3D political chess regarding slavery? Or did anyone actually care about the Neutrality Act just for the sake of the rule of law?
It is the defining historical question of the 1850s, and it is a debate that continues today.
Okay, so it's not a settled issue.
To navigate that, we should look at the perspective of historian Robert E. May, who wrote the definitive modern accounts of this era, specifically Manifest Destiny's Underworld and the Southern Dream of a Caribbean Empire.
What's his take on it?
May emphasizes that distinguishing personal, legal conviction from sectional political motivation in this specific period is incredibly difficult, almost impossible.
Because the political atmosphere was just too toxic to separate the two.
Precisely. By the mid-1850s, almost every single issue in American life, tariffs, a railroad roads westward expansion, and certainly foreign policy, had become a proxy battle over slavery.
Everything was viewed through that lens.
Everything. May argues that the honest historical answer requires us to hold both possibilities in tension.
Meaning what, exactly?
Were there Northerners, and even some Southerners, who genuinely despised filibustering because it was violent, illegal, and chaotic?
Yes. Okay.
Were there politicians who genuinely believed in the sanctity of international law and the sovereignty of foreign nations? Certainly.
But those voices just get drowned out.
They get entirely co-opted by the undeniable reality that filibustering was functionally and practically a pro-slavery project.
You cannot neatly separate a Northern voter's respect for the Neutrality Act from their absolute terror of the slave power conspiracy.
The two motivations were fused together.
That makes a lot of sense.
When the North demanded the federal government crack down on filibusters, they were demanding a crackdown on slavery's vanguard.
And when the South demanded these adventurers be protected or pardoned, they were fiercely protecting their own economic and political future.
It was entirely transactional.
Which brings us to the most unenviable, impossible job in America at the time, the presidency.
Oh, what a nightmare job that was.
Right. How on earth does a president enforce a federal law when the northern half of the country is screaming for a military crackdown on filibusters and the southern half of the country is demanding they be given ticker-tape parades and congressional medals?
You end up with an executive branch walking a federal tightrope that is fraying violently at both ends.
The practical day-to-day problem of governance just becomes completely paralyzed by the ideological split.
We see this incredibly uneven, hypocritical crackdown from the federal government throughout the decade.
I look at the presidents of this era, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan, and they act like political weather vanes.
They really do.
Depending on which way the sectional wind is blowing, their policies completely change.
They all issue very stern, very official neutrality proclamations.
They authorize the U.S. Navy and federal marshals to arrest filibusters.
But all three of them also wink, hesitate, or conveniently look the other way when the political math requires it.
Because they were constantly trying to appease two entirely incompatible constituencies.
Take Franklin Pierce, for example.
What did he do?
He has to publicly disavow the Ostend Manifesto to calm down the furious Northern press, but privately, His administration continued to actively flirt with the idea of buying Cuba to keep the southern wing of his party satisfied.
It's just two-faced. And then you have James Buchanan, who actually wins the presidency in 1856 and takes office in 1857.
Right.
This is the guy who co-authored the Ostend Manifesto. He literally wrote the blueprint for stealing Cuba.
And now he is the president.
Who has to stand up and publicly condemn filibustering to hold the fragile union together, all while privately coveting Cuba for his entire political career.
The cognitive dissonance is staggering. It is. This executive paralysis comes to a spectacular head-on collision in late 1857.
This is the story of Commodore Hiram Paulding.
Yes, and it perfectly illustrates the impossible corner the federal government had painted itself into.
Okay, let's set the stage for this. William Walker, our notorious filibuster, has actually managed to conquer Nicaragua briefly, ruled it as a dictator, and then was forcibly kicked out by a coalition of Central American armies.
He got chased out, yeah.
But he is a fanatic. He immediately regroups, raises more money in the South, and sails back down to try and conquer Nicaragua a second time.
He just wouldn't give up.
He lands his forces on the coast at Punta Arenas. But this time, the U.S. Navy is waiting for him.
Commodore Hiram Paulding, commanding the U.S. Navy Home Squadron, sails into the harbor.
And Paulding decides he is not going to wait for Walker to break the law on the high seas.
No, Paulding takes extreme action.
He lands his own armed American sailors and Marines on Nicaraguan soil, surrounds Walker's camp, forces him to surrender, and physically removes him from a foreign country to bring him back to the United States to face justice.
Now, on the surface, you would think the anti-filibuster crowds in the North would be thrilled.
Finally, a federal officer is showing some teeth and enforcing the Neutrality Act.
Paulding is cheered as a hero in northern newspapers.
But the mechanics of what Paulding actually did detonated a massive constitutional and international crisis.
It was a huge mess.
Right, because a United States naval officer just landed armed combat troops on foreign soil without that foreign nation's explicit permission to arrest an American citizen who hadn't technically committed a crime within U.S. jurisdiction at that exact moment.
It is a stunning legal paradox.
It hurts my brain to even think about.
The federal government is trying to punish a man for illegally invading a foreign country by having its own military illegally invade that exact same foreign country to arrest him.
Did Commodore Paulding violate the sovereign territory of Nicaragua in order to enforce a domestic U.S. neutrality statute?
That was the massive question. The irony is just blinding.
And the Southern politicians go completely ballistic, obviously.
Oh, they were furious.
They accuse Paulding of acting like a military dictator, trampling on the constitutional rights of an American citizen, and violating international law, the very international law Walker was violating.
So President Buchanan is trapped.
Totally boxed in. His own Navy just achieved the result the North demanded, but using a method that infuriated the South and technically created a diplomatic incident.
It's a lose-lose situation for him.
How does Buchanan handle this?
He handles it with a masterpiece of political tap dancing.
To tell.
In January 1858, Buchanan sends a special message to Congress specifically addressing the Paulding affair. He tells Congress that he genuinely welcomes Walker's removal from Central America.
Okay, so he's happy with the outcome.
He states that it is a net positive that Walker's destructive expedition was stopped.
So he says, I love the result.
But I condemn the method.
Classic politician move.
Buchanan immediately pivots and suggests that Commodore Paulding committed a grave error and exceeded his legal authority by landing troops on foreign soil.
He essentially throws his own naval officer under the bus to appease Southern anger, while quietly accepting the strategic benefit of having Walker removed.
Exactly. This singular moment captures the entire posture of the federal government in the 1850s.
The administration desperately wanted filibustering stopped because it was causing diplomatic nightmares with European powers and tearing the domestic political fabric apart.
But they desperately needed to be seen deploring the means of stopping it.
Right, so they wouldn't alienate the powerful Southern base of the Democratic Party.
This isn't principled statecraft. This isn't a president standing tall for the rigid rule of law.
Not at all. It's a terrified executive branch desperately managing two furious, incompatible audiences.
Trying to kick the can of civil war down the road just a few more months.
Which creates a remarkably dangerous environment for someone like William Walker.
It gave him a false sense of security.
Because Walker is a true ideologue. He is completely oblivious to the fact that his political cover in Washington is rapidly evaporating.
He assumes the South will always protect him, and he assumes the federal government is far too weak and divided to actually punish him.
He starts believing his own press clippings.
He does. And this hubris leads him to roll the dice one final time.
Which moves our story away from the halls of Congress and the courtrooms of San Francisco down to the malarial shores of Honduras.
The unsentimental end of William Walker.
By 1860, the era of winking and nodding by authorities is over, but Walker simply cannot read the geopolitical room.
He was completely blind to the reality.
Let's dive into the mechanics of this final expedition. It is August 1860. Walker has spent the last few years touring the South, giving speeches, and he has just published a self-justifying memoir called The War in Nicaragua.
Trying to paint himself as a misunderstood visionary who is betrayed by his own government.
Exactly. So he scrounges together a meager force, far smaller and less equipped than his previous armies.
It was a last-ditch effort.
He sails south and lands near Trujillo, a historic coastal town in Honduras.
Right.
He manages to capture the old Spanish fort there and immediately starts issuing his usual grandiose proclamations.
Acting like a king again.
But this time, the wall he hits isn't a disorganized local militia that he can outshoot. And it isn't a U.S. Navy ship commanded by an officer worried about domestic politics.
No, the wall he hits is the British Empire.
We have to understand why the British are suddenly involved here.
The British Empire had significant geopolitical and economic interests in Central America, primarily related to the Mosquito Coast and the potential future construction of an interoceanic canal.
They viewed this region as a crucial zone for global trade.
And they demanded stability. They had absolutely no patience left for a rogue American freelancer repeatedly destabilizing the area and threatening their economic interests.
So into the harbor of Trujillo sails the HMS Icarus, a British warship commanded by a Royal Navy officer, Captain Noel Salmon.
Captain Salmon assesses the situation. He looks at Walker and his small band of starving, diseased men holed up in this old fort.
And Salmon doesn't negotiate.
Not at all. He essentially tells Walker, the game is over. Surrender to me immediately.
Walker looks at the guns of the British warship and realizes he is completely outmatched. He surrenders to Captain Salmon.
Now, we have to assume that Walker believed this surrender would follow the usual script.
What was the usual script?
He likely thought Salmon would deport him back to the United States, where he would face another federal trial, hire a good lawyer, and get acquitted by a sympathetic jury in New Orleans in a matter of minutes.
But Captain Salmon has no intention of playing the American political game.
None whatsoever.
I want to look at this moment with the measured, unsentimental precision it requires, because the reality of it is incredibly stark.
It really is.
Captain Salmon accepts Walker's surrender, but Salmon understands exactly how dysfunctional the American judicial system is regarding filibusters.
He wasn't going to send him back to be let go again.
So instead of putting Walker on a ship to New York or New Orleans, Salmon turns Walker directly over to the local Honduran military authorities.
He hands him over to the very people whose town Walker just invaded and occupied.
That is a death sentence.
It is a calculated transfer of authority. Walker is brought before a Honduran court. He is charged with piracy and filibusterism.
And it is here, right at the bitter end, that Walker's profound arrogance really shows.
No. Unbelievable.
Standing before a tribunal of Honduran officers, Walker tries to rely on the intricate loopholes of the American legal system.
He attempts a lawyer's defense.
He argues that filibusterism is not a recognized crime in traditional international law. He argues that the charge of piracy is invalid because piracy, by strict maritime legal definition, requires robbery on the high seas, and his actions took place on land.
He is citing 19th century maritime case law technicalities to the military officers whose sovereign territory he just violently attacked.
It is the ultimate hubris. He expects the strict textual technicalities of a courtroom to shield him from the violent reality of his own actions.
And it fails utterly.
The Honduran authorities are not interested in debating American legal semantics.
They have suffered years of instability and violence because of men like him.
Yeah.
They swiftly condemn him to death.
On September 12, 1860, the 36-year-old William Walker is marched out to a ruined wall, shot by a firing squad, and buried in the Trujillo Old Cemetery.
Just like that.
I want to pause on that image. We have followed this guy from being treated like a conquering hero in the streets of San Francisco to ruling a country as a dictator to this incredibly bleak, lonely ending.
The federal government didn't lift a single finger to save him, did they?
Not a single diplomatic cable was sent to save his life.
The stark reality of the event is what we must reflect on. The most famous American filibuster in history died a foreign prisoner.
He was executed by a small developing republic that he had the arrogance to try and conquer.
He was delivered to that firing squad by a captain of the British Empire.
And most tellingly, he died completely unmourned by the United States government.
The very nation whose grand destiny he loudly claimed to be fulfilling.
You really have to sit with the tension of this bleak reality rather than try to resolve it too neatly.
It's complicated.
The federal government that passed the Neutrality Act didn't kill William Walker. The sympathetic juries that nullified the law didn't save him.
In the end, he was crushed by the brute geopolitical reality that his own country was too fractured to either fully support his ambitions or cleanly punish his crimes.
He fell through the cracks of a breaking nation, leaving him vulnerable to foreign powers that simply did not care about American domestic politics.
It's a sobering, cold end to a life built on pure adrenaline and ideological fanaticism.
But what I find truly incredible about Walker's execution is the timing.
The timing is incredible.
September 12th, 1860, that is just 7 weeks before the presidential election of Abraham Lincoln.
Yes.
The death of the filibuster movement seamlessly, almost poetically, bleeds directly into the birth of the American Civil War.
The timeline is impossible to ignore. The golden age of filibustering and the antebellum period of the United States end at the exact same moment.
But I'm curious about the mechanics of that end. How does the Civil War officially kill off this movement?
Well, think about it.
Because obviously there are no more major private expeditions after 1860. Did everyone just wake up one morning and decide invading Cuba was a bad idea?
The Civil War achieved, through massive internal trauma, what no presidential proclamation, no naval arrest by Commodore Paulding, and no federal jury could ever manage.
Which was?
It ended the golden age of filibustering by completely consuming its raw material.
The raw material being young men, money, and weapons.
Exactly. If you look at the energy that drove filibustering in the 1850s, it was fueled by a surplus of violent ambition.
You had thousands of young men seeking glory, wealth, and ideological victory.
And you had millions of dollars in private financing from wealthy Southern planters who were desperate to expand their slaveholding empire.
When the Civil War begins with the bombardment of Fort Sumter in April 1861, all of that outward-facing American aggression is suddenly internalized.
The restless young men who would have eagerly signed up in a New Orleans hotel lobby to sail to Nicaragua are suddenly marching toward domestic battlefields like Bull Run, Shiloh, and Antietam.
They don't need to charter a steamship and cross an ocean to find a war.
No, the war is in their own backyard.
The exact same guys who fought in the jungles of the tropics are now wearing Confederate gray in Virginia.
And this traces the ultimate, definitive death of the movement.
Filibustering didn't lose a legal argument in the Supreme Court. It lost its constituency.
The entire logistical and financial infrastructure of the movement was hollowed out and violently redirected into the Confederate war effort.
And crucially, when the Civil War ended in 1865 and the 13th Amendment officially abolished slavery, it entirely destroyed the sectional coalition that had given filibustering its political purpose and its protection.
Because the underlying goal, as we discussed with the Ostend Manifesto, was always the acquisition of new slave states.
No slavery, no reason to invade Cuba.
The Southern dream of a Caribbean empire built on the backs of enslaved labor was wiped off the map forever.
Filibustering died when the slavery politics behind it died.
The men who fought those private wars were dead on Civil War battlefields. The plantation money that funded them was gone, and the ideological motivation was constitutionally eradicated.
It proves, in retrospect, how deeply intertwined the two forces really were.
The Ostend Manifesto wasn't a diplomatic aberration. It was the quiet part of American expansion said out loud.
The juries in New Orleans weren't just chaotic local anomalies. They were actively fighting a legal proxy war for their domestic institution.
Which brings all these threads together beautifully.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to ask you, listening to this, to reflect on the core theme we've been circling. What happens when a nation's laws no longer reflect a shared national reality?
It's a terrifying thought.
We just spent the last hour looking at an America where a federal legal standard, the Neutrality Act, utterly failed.
It failed against recurring acquittals by local juries.
And those acquittals were driven entirely by regional loyalty, economic self-interest, and ideological division.
The law printed in the statute books meant absolutely nothing because the people sitting in the jury box simply opted out of the national consensus.
And that leaves us with a final, I think, very provocative thought to mull over.
If a federal law is genuinely only as strong as the local jury, or the local authority willing to enforce it, to what extent does geography actually dictate justice?
Think about the implications of that for today's world. We live in an era where local or state entities frequently decide to act as sanctuaries against or nullifiers of federal mandates that they passionately disagree with.
When local authorities draw a line and say, we will not enforce this federal law in our jurisdiction because it violates our community's values, are we witnessing a healthy exercise of local democracy?
Or are we just echoing the exact same constitutional fractures of 1850s America?
Does the rule of law exist universally across a nation, or does it fundamentally change the moment you cross a county line?
That is a heavy, lingering question. Are we doomed to repeat the same cycle of regional nullification whenever the country becomes too divided to agree on what the law means?
That is something for you to deeply explore on your own.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration of history's intricate and often completely unresolvable tensions.
We've walked through the sweltering courtrooms, the hushed diplomatic back channels of Europe, and finally stood before the firing squad in Honduras.
Keep digging into the past because the mechanisms of history are always bleeding into the present.